Okay. The screen that you are seeing, is it your title screen?
It is.
Excellent, excellent. It's, again, I've got like multiple monitors going on. I apologize. My name is Billy Spivak from Accelerant Research. So I'd like to welcome everybody who is joining for the first time today, and those of you who have been with us throughout the day and have been anxiously awaiting Jamie Sherman to speak to us today about a topic that I'm very curious about, because usually I know by the title what you're going to be speaking on. And this one I'm totally stumped. So I'm very excited. Legibility, what, how, and why it matters. So it's a very provocative title there. And Jamie comes to us from Netflix. She's a senior product researcher, and I'm going to let her go ahead and take it away.
Awesome, thank you.
And I'm going to stop sharing, and you should be able to now.
I'm going to start. So I'm going to try sharing this as a window, and then you can all tell me what you see. No, you see not what I was hoping you would see. Let's see.
Of course not.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to do it a different way.
Okay. We can see your wonderful dog, though.
Excellent. He is my visual
happy.
Entertainment for when, if you get bored with what I'm talking about, you can always look at the dog.
Excellent.
Okay, can you all see the title slide now?
I believe everyone can. And if anyone has any questions along the way that you would like Jamie to address, please put it in the chat button for us. And Jamie, I'll go ahead and monitor that for you too, okay?
That sounds great. And I tell people sometimes that I come from a very interrupty culture, both in my home and my work life. So if there are questions that come up that seem relevant, then it's just fine if you interrupt. And if not, we'll have Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just sort of like, it's about myself first, but I'll just address the fact that you said, oh, it's a mysterious title. And that's really interesting, because part of what I'm going to be talking about is not being mysterious necessarily, and how to think about that. But really, when I was asked to do this talk, Bill said, oh, you can talk about something that may be a presentation you've given before. And I said, I don't have a fixed presentation, but I do have a bunch of soapboxes and things that I will rant about at will. And so legibility is really the framework that I came up with as a way to pull together some of the themes in the soapboxes that I talk about pretty regularly when people ask me questions, and I find myself going on and on about. So anyway, we'll just walk through it. I'll tell you a little bit about who I am first. So first of all, some of what I call the dry facts about me. I got my PhD in cultural anthropology at Princeton. Before that, I was studying performance studies and religion, and before that, theater directing. So I have kind of an eclectic background. Today, I'm a senior product researcher at Netflix Studio Insights. That's a relatively recent transition. Before that, I spent about 9 years as a social research scientist at Intel. And today, I can't help but pitch. I am co-chair of the Ethnographic Praxis and Industry Conference, which for those of you on this line, if you're not aware of it, you should be, and you should check it out, because it's a fantastic community and resource, and it's coming up soon. They also have tutorials and talks and panels. It's a whole big thing. So epicpeople.org. And if you ask me at the end, I'll repeat that. Again, just some dry facts. My primary focus for the last few years has been on media and content creators and emerging technology. My background, my wheelhouse is qualitative and ethnographics skills. I'm also, for a qual person, I think of myself as extraordinarily sort of quant fascinated. I've said in the past that I want my very own data scientist to be attached to the hip. So I have a record of international and remote research, 12 patents filed, a cadence of published papers, and various kinds of recognitions for innovation and business impact. A few kind of what I call the wet facts, or not the dry facts. I grew up in Berkeley, California. I have 3 older brothers, which it might explain that interrupty culture. I used to be a theater artist. I think I mentioned that. I think one of the things that might tell you is that I really am deeply passionate about collaboration. I truly believe that when we come together, we are more than the sum of our parts. And even more than that, I was actually a theater director before I became an anthropologist. And I think that matters because the perspective as an actor, for example, has to be very much within the role. But when you're a director, you're really thinking about the big picture as well as all of the details, and you're thinking about how it all fits together. And I think as a theater director, I define myself as somebody who used theater as a way of asking questions. What could this mean? What could this be? As an anthropologist, I think of myself as asking similar questions about what is this? What is it trying to be? What does it actually mean? So there's actually quite a bit of continuity in thinking about how the details add up to the picture that we see. Some of the things that I do really well, I drive high impact user research initiatives into strategy, engineering, and product. I create frameworks for thinking about complex, messy spaces. What I mean by that is oftentimes you'll hear people about a particular topic say, it's just, there is no pattern here. It's all just like so variable, you can't really say anything. And my response to that is, one, that's just not possible. There are always patterns. And one of the things that I do is I take those variabilities and those different sort of individual stories and really think about what are some of the ways that we could make sense of this? What does that help us do? What are the limitations of the way that we're making sense of it, the buckets that we're using? That is something that is kind of one of my strengths. I'm a storyteller. I think of myself as an experimental pragmatist. That means that I don't really care about the method that much as long as it gets me where I want to go. And I will freely adapt, borrow, and steal from anything. And I rarely remember the names of the methods I use because they're all just another way of getting at the question. My happy place is working on hard, difficult problems with smart people who like what they do. I like to have fun and work hard. Those things to me go together. They're not separate. So actually, I think the better title for this might have been Legibility, What, Why, and How to Do It. But this really is, again, sort of a way of pulling together some of the ways that I've come to think about the work that I do, and also some of the ways that I think of have been helpful to me in thinking about how to represent myself, how to talk about what I do, in terms of both looking for a job, in terms of being on the job. And then finally, because I am a social scientist and because this is what we do, I want to take my own framework and then sort of think about the risks and limits of thinking about it this way. What might we lose by thinking about legibility? So legibility, this definition at the top comes from Merriam-Webster online. It's not deep in any particular, or theoretically thick in any particular way, but I really kind of like it because it also, partly because it just has the two meanings are really quite fun, and because it has this inexplicably amusing and dark quote from Thomas Wolfe. So the first one, capable of being read or deciphered, just, can you read it? And the second, the idea of murder sweltering in his heart being legible on his face, but importantly, sort of this idea of being understood. How can I be discoverable? How can my insights be discoverable or understood? What does it mean to be discovered and understood? And the second piece I want to bring to this is something that I took from, I guess, my first graduate program, where I was in an interdisciplinary program at NYU, Gallatin School. And in one of our first year seminars, we did a lot of reading across different disciplines within the humanities and social sciences. This comes from reader response theory. And it is the idea that a text in itself is not a fixed and solid thing. It doesn't mean only the words, it's actually what the reader brings to it. So the meaning of a text is actually a mutual creation of the reader plus the text. And that matters a lot to me when I think about how people understand me, how I understand them, that this is actually, if we think of text not just as words on paper, but text as many different things. This presentation can be seen as a text. An interview can be seen as a text. How is the meaning of that created? I think it's actually a mutual creation as opposed to a single thing that resides within me or within you. So this is kind of my basic message in terms of thinking about job searching and being on the job. And the first thing that I want to say is that looking for work sucks, and we should all just acknowledge that. It's hard, it's miserable, and you don't get paid for it. So that aside, I want to share a quick story. Some of you, if any of you know me from any previous life or have heard me talk before, you may have heard the story before. But when people ask me about how I made the transition from academia into industry, I tell them that my graduate program was extraordinarily bad at professionalization in ways that I both love. It was intellectually incredibly nurturing because it wasn't about how do you get a job. It was about what are you seeing? What are your insights? How do you think about this? But the downside is that they didn't say anything about how to get a job or anything outside of academia. And so when I realized that for various reasons that I won't necessarily go into, but that I needed to look outside of the academic market in terms of my future, I didn't know. I was like, I don't know what it's called. I don't know what, I can't even read the classified ads because I don't know what nobody says wanted anthropologists who studied bodybuilders. Nobody. And so I don't know what the positions are. I don't know what the levels are. I don't know what industries I'm looking at. I have no idea where to go. And so I started what I called a new research project, which was called What Do Anthropologists Do When They're Not Teaching? And for that project, I reached far and wide doing what we might call a rolling recruit of my entire network for anyone that looked like an anthropologist or a social scientist of any kind that was working outside of academia. And I contacted them and I said, tell me what you do and how you got there. So I think though that I don't know the backgrounds of the folks here on the line, but if you're a researcher or a user researcher or a market researcher of any kind, I think it's familiar territory to think of the need to understand the market or the industry or the users. But here I'm really talking about understanding the industry and how do I actually how do I understand the employers? I'll say, and I've said this certainly before, informational interviews are a gift from the universe to you in this project because people will do them. When you come to people and you're asking for information and not for a job, many of us have been on the other side. Many of us, feel like it is a way of giving back, and it's just a great gift. It's a real gift of access. But when you do an informational interview, I think it's worth thinking about, like, what are you actually looking for? How do you get to know your reader? How do you actually take your assumptions about an industry or a market or what it means to be, for example, a market researcher? Because I have a lot of biases and assumptions, by the way, about market research that I come to this with, having grown up, as I remind you, in Berkeley, which is a sort of a rich history of anti-capitalism. And being against the man. And so market research has a little bit of a connotation that I will freely admit I had, I kind of walk into it going, ugh. But so what do we do when we flip that on its head? So thinking about, turning my assumptions on their head, asking myself, how do researchers see themselves? How do people in those fields see themselves? Do I resonate with that? So in one of my informational interviews, I talked to somebody who absolutely hated what he did and hated the company that we were talking about. And as he was talking, I'm like, that sounds awesome. That sounds great. I would love that. And all of the things that he disliked were things that I actually felt like were really, really wonderful. So you have to kind of think about, sort of listening through the interview, and doing your homework. I think, Google, internet, and LinkedIn are my friends. I internet stalk people all the time. I read what they wrote. I read, when I was in graduate school, I read their papers and their dissertations before I talked to them, sometimes with awkward results when I asked people about things that they had written 20 years before, but nonetheless, it kind of gave me a sense of context for them and what they'd been interested in, and where they started versus where they ended up, which is always super fascinating because people study things like, I studied bodybuilders and now I study people who make movies and do data science. And then finally, just sort of one sort of caveat is to say, being on it, you can be honest about the fact that you're looking for a job or if you're transitioning, but I would say just don't ask for a job, because when you agree to an informational interview on the other side, as a person giving the interview, that was part of the sort of essential contract, is that I don't necessarily have a job to give. And if I do, then it's up to me to offer, if I do have a job opening. So it's worth being honest, because in fact, that is how I got my first job in industry, is by doing an informational interview, but don't ask for it. That's not advancing. There we go. So then thinking about how to translate that back into my text, right? The opening that you saw is actually the opening that I used in my recent round of interviews when I was on the job market. And one of the things the reasons that I put that in is because I remembered something somebody had told me about writing a 5-paragraph essay, which seems kind of silly, but that in the introduction, you tell people what they're going to read, and then you explain it to them, and then you tell them what they read. And so that was my attempt to sort of really control the narrative. And when I wanted to talk about my work, I wanted to tell them what they were going to see. I wanted them to tell them what they would see so that then they could see it. But I think importantly, I really think that when I was doing the informational interviews, one of the things that I really listen for is how do people, not just what they say, but how do they talk? What is the kind of language that they use, so that when I wrote my resume, I could use that kind of language, I could use that kind of framing. Thinking about, do you talk about, I early in my career, I came to Intel and I was like, oh, they call them users. That's what they call the people that they talk to. And if I call them users, people will know who I mean. And so thinking, and that seems like it's a silly example, but really thinking about, do they call them, they don't call them cross-disciplinary, they call them cross-functional. And actually that's kind of the same thing, because what we mean is people coming to a project from different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of thinking. And so I can take my experiences and my skill sets and put them into a language that my readers, my potential employers can actually understand what I'm saying. Is not that I worked with people who are majored in economics and history, but rather that I worked with a cross-functional group of researchers on a particular project. Right. Second, putting yourself in their shoes, kind of understanding what it is that they want to know, as opposed to what I want them to know. And some examples of that are for, what I think that when I first came into interviewing, oftentimes I felt really compelled to convince people that I was smart and capable. And that wasn't a mistake, because actually people don't care, or they've already assumed that you are, or they wouldn't be interviewing you in the first place. What they really want to know as employers are, since I have a job opening, that means I have a problem or a set of problems that I need to solve. What I want to know is, can you help me solve my problem? Will you help me? Will you make me successful? Will you fit in with my team and be a good colleague for the people that I work with? Will you fit in with the sort of environment that I have to offer? Because I have I put a lot of energy into looking for people to fill my team, and to have to do it all over again feels exhausting on the employer side as well. So how can you help me understand, that you can solve my problem? How can you show me ways that you can help me be successful, perhaps by showing me ways that you've helped other people be successful, or other teams be successful in the past? How can you show me that you'll be a good fit for my team? And that last one I think is really interesting, because actually when I go into a job interview I also as an interviewee, I have the same question. You know, will I fit with this team? I don't want to take a job and be unhappy. And so some of what I was telling you, for example, up front, was to say, here's who I am. You know, this is the way I work. This is you know, tell me, is this a good fit, right? Can I give you a sense of who I am so that you can give me a sense of who you are, and we can decide if we're a good match? It's like dating, right? And so all of these constructs, I will say, help me a lot in getting out of the frame set of trying to convince people that I'm worthy and smart, which is just a terrible, terrible experience and makes me feel insecure and miserable, and I don't actually perform well. But I want to talk now again about legibility in terms of the job itself. And this is something I will say that I think other people may pick up more quickly than I did. I felt like it took me a while to figure out that my real research project when I was on the job was actually not the research that I performed as part of my job, but the research that I did on my job itself. Figuring out what my job is, figuring out who my stakeholders are, figuring out what do they care about, what are the problems that they're trying to solve, what is the kind of information that actually matters, how can I present it in ways that actually make sense to you. I discovered at Intel, and I say this actually with great affection, that engineers at Intel love spreadsheets. Spreadsheets make them happy. You know, that, and so I said, oh, I can do spreadsheets. I can show you graphs. Graphs make you happy. Pie charts make you happy. I can do that. And so being willing to kind of also flex how I talk about my data, how I talk about, you know, so both in terms of you know, I think the kinds of data that I collect, realizing, for example, that for the engineers, again, that I worked with, it not only mattered that you were working on a film versus audio, but it mattered, because I work on media, it actually mattered how many screens you have, and how big they were, and if they're plugged into the wall. That's data I can collect, but I won't collect it unless I know it's important. And so realizing that for them to make the kinds of decisions that they had to make on the basis of my research, this was the kind of data that actually made a difference in making those decisions. And then again, sort of like, and how do I present it? And even sometimes how I analyze it. In one of my last projects at Intel, we were trying to prioritize use cases. And one of my closest partners said, hey, if we put it in a spreadsheet, and we actually score it by you know, how many people in our stories, you know, we have the stories on one side and the different use cases we've identified, and we can score down the bottom how many of them actually would use this use case, and then we add it up at the bottom, we'll actually know which ones are most important, because the number of people that use that will tell us something about the scale of that use case. Now, I'll tell you, as an anthropologist, this is not how I normally do my analysis. I just don't think that way. I have a whole other set of processes, more like, you know, sticky notes and affinity maps and coding, and something I tend to call soft focus as I kind of look across and think about the patterns that I'm seeing. But I listened to my friend David, and I said, okay. Why? Because I think there were a few different reasons. One, it wasn't a terrible method. Two, it brought him into my research and really leveraged the fact that he was engaging in a really important way. It made him part of the project and gave him ownership over what we were doing. And three, again, in the context of legibility, he could understand, he could follow exactly what we were doing. And so it gave him a real way of thinking about the findings that made them more impactful for that team. So this is kind of this soapbox is again to just sort of say that I think that about 80% of my research tends to be internally focused. I tend to think of the external research as if you have a background in research already, if you went to school and studied something that sort of taught you how to do research and analysis, that the actual research that we do as researchers is I don't want to say trivial, but it fairly goes without saying that you know how to do it. It's not actually terribly difficult to do. It's really it's really that translation and really that internal research and continuing that I find has been the most impactful for me in making my work impactful and enabling me to communicate it, enabling me to be legible. And the final insight I'll share, and for some of you, this may not matter, but for others of us who wonder, why am I staring at these org charts, or how do I know where I sit? Org charts are like our relationships. And I learned this, it took me about 3 years to figure this out, because before that, I'm like, I don't know, it's a bunch of like, mostly guys, because I worked in a tech company. It's a bunch of guys. They all look the same. I don't know who they are or why I care. But then I realized at some point I had this epiphany. I said, oh, these are like genealogies. These tell me who my cousins are. They tell me who I'm related to. They tell me who I'm close to. And this matters even more in the context of companies that reorganize on a regular basis, because when a company reorganizes, it changes your relationships. It changes, even if it doesn't change who you report to, it changes who's close to you. It changes who you collaborate with and how you collaborate with them. It changes who's senior to you. And so who are your elders? And even if they're 15 years younger, it doesn't really matter. If they're up here, then they're still on some level an elder. Even in a flat organization, it just sort of says something about their role, about how they think, about what they're doing. The other interesting thing about org charts is that it turns out that they are ways of thinking. They are literally ways of organizing thought when you think about a company. And so I've started to see them, I've started to look at them as a reflection of the way the company itself thinks about what it's doing. So those are just some of the reasons I look at those, and I think they're worth reading. So this is kind of the last part of what I really have to say, and then we can kind of open this up to conversation. But I actually went back when I thought of, hey, legibility is actually a really interesting way of thinking about what these soapboxes and these rants that I have and these stories that I tell. And I went back to look at the theory that comes, the origins of the notion of legibility, because I really did first hear about this in anthropology coursework. And I was like, oh, actually, legibility was a critique. The origins of legibility in anthropology come from the work of James Scott and thinking about the relationship between governments and people. And one of the questions that he was looking at is, why is it that governments impose these programs that don't work, that actually oftentimes do as much damage as they do good? And one of the things that he came up with is that in order to understand, governments have a tendency to try to make order in what is in fact not exactly orderly, or not ordered in a sort of very schematic way. And the picture that this is actually from his book, shows kind of a natural forest and then a planned forest that is sort of top down planted. And what's missing in that picture, that the organic forest lives, it has its life cycle, it reproduces itself, it sustains itself. The planned forest actually does not, because it's missing all of the ecosystem that sustains it. It's missing all of the non-forest, the non-tree plants and animals that actually make the forest a living thing. And so I think it's worth thinking about in your work, or in your looking for work, what do you miss when you create legibility for yourself and for your employers? What are you not saying? What does that order leave out? And literally, what kind of violence is done as we organize our materials into legible, readable kinds of insights? So when we think, sometimes when we present our insights, it's tempting. And I think I've been telling you all, all about how to make yourself legible, but what did I leave out? What did in the way that I organized it in order to be legible, what did I miss? Is there anything important that doesn't easily categorize itself? And I'm thinking here about actually in the work that I was doing, recently at Intel around creative content makers. One of the things that I could never figure out, like why it mattered, was that people had a different way of, thinking about what is creative. When we think about content creators, what is the creative part? And I started asking people, partly because I was kind of curious, and we had an hypothesis that, the whole point of technology is to help you be creative. Then what we need to do is enable that creative part, and then help you with the other stuff that you don't want to do. But we had ideas about what that creative part was, and I started asking people, and it really was quite interesting and very difficult to figure out why it would matter for your computer. Which is what I was actually helping the silicon architects think about, was what needs to be on silicon architecture in order to support the work of content creators. So it's very hard to think about like the idea of, for example, creativity as service to an idea as opposed to vision of an idea. Why that matters for the silicon architecture, I don't know. I really don't. But I will say that I think it does. And so occasionally I find that I will oftentimes try to be legible, but also include some of the illegibility that I find, the things that I don't know why they fit. And I say, I'm not sure how this fits. I'm just going to put it out there and tell you that I think it matters, and we're going to hold it and think about that. So just to encourage you to not let go of the slight chaos of all of this, now that I've spent half an hour telling you to be readable. And that's it. That is the end. And I'll just share finally that this is more how I think of myself than the regimented orderly forest. This is, if you can see my room, you can also see that's probably reflected in my aesthetic. It's a little bit more organic forest than ordered. So thank you. And I just want to open it up to questions. You're on mute, Billy.
Some questions have just been popping in. One of them be coming from Rosie. How difficult was it for you to adjust your writing or presentation style moving from academic life to corporate life, especially with your idea of leaving out violence?
So that's actually a great question. I have a few different thoughts about it. So anthropology is a storytelling genre. Most anthropology, most ethnographies tend to start with some version. Actually, most of them start with some version is, I went to this place to study this thing and then something else happened, so this is what I studied instead. But nonetheless, they often start with scenarios and stories, and those I still find quite useful, really useful in kind of helping people understand what I mean by the kinds of sort of dry insight. So if I say, people really care about, the why does latency matter, for example, when you're using a media product, and I can tell them a story that I heard from somebody about how crazy it makes them. So not just the quote, but kind of the story and setting the scene. And so in some ways sort of preserving that, but in other ways I will say even it's not even just the academia to industry, but each company has its own, I would say, communication genre. So at Intel, for example, everything was PowerPoint. It was all bullet points. I learned over time to communicate not in full sentences, not in writing. Nobody would read it. Bullet points, and then tell the story. And every presentation starts with a TLDR, because actually they are very interrupty, and in some cases, depending on who you're presenting to, you have about 5 minutes, and that's all you're going to get before people start asking questions and things. So you're not always guaranteed to get through your material. But where I am now is actually quite different. At Netflix, we communicate a great deal through memos, and people write out their ideas in Google Sheets and they share them. And actually a lot of the conversation happens through the comments that we have back and forth. And so it's a completely different way of communicating that I'm still getting used to. And still, and there's some things I really like about it. Does that answer the question, Billy?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So yes, it is kind of challenging, but think of it, I think of it sometimes as genres of writing, right?
And how long did it take you to make that transition to feel comfortable in the non-academic world?
So I think it was a gradual transition. So for me, I was fortunate enough in some ways that when I was first hired at Intel, I was in the labs, I was in the R&D space, and actually I was hired into a group of it was Genevieve Bell, who some of you may have heard of as an anthropologist who was senior fellow at Intel. She at that time had a lab, and we had a combination. We had three groups of people. We had designers, we had technologists, and we had social scientists that we were working together thinking about the future. But being hired into that group of social scientists was a real boon for me because there was a lot more latitude to think and talk about sort of academically, and even the group as a whole was very research oriented. And so it was much more familiar in terms of the modes of communication. When the company reorganized, which by the way was a surprise to me, it hadn't occurred to me that organizations reorganize. And I make a point now of telling everybody that's coming out of academia, just be prepared. And I also tell people that of all the reorganizations that I've been through, I'm still mad about that one. The other ones I knew were coming. That one I didn't know, and I'm kind of bitter about it because I had a great job. Nonetheless, I found myself in more of a sort of business-oriented profit and loss, and that was sort of probably about 2 years in, and that was a bit of what I call a rude awakening when I realized I was actually employed at a corporation, and I was going to have to get used to it. And so I tell people it definitely took me a few years to even realize what had happened and what I had done. I've seen many other people who are much more, I don't know what just happened. I suddenly went, I can stop sharing.
Okay.
I gotta stop sharing it all. And so, yeah, so it took me a while. I think keep working at it if it's taking you a while. And sometimes I think you don't realize what you've learned until you talk to somebody who hasn't yet learned those things, or you start to see things a little bit differently. And so it definitely took me a while. I'm slow on the uptake sometimes.
Well, and the next question comes from Catherine, and she has one that very much does tie into what you were just talking about, getting used to big organizations. She said, thinking of those highly matrixed organizations in relationship to Scott, particularly those with both a direct and indirect service component, makes her want to start asking this question to business partners and business owners. When does order get in the way of success?
I think that's a fantastic question. I suspect, depending on where you work, you may or may not get, it feels almost like the kind of question that you'll get at through other stories about other things, and that will be part of it's like your research question as opposed to the question you pose to participants. And I'm only talking here from my experience with the people that I work with. There are a few of whom I could ask such a philosophical question and that would respond and be really interested in that. And those are the people that I like to keep close and I want to work with again. But there are a lot of other people for whom they wouldn't know how to answer that question. But I do think that those questions come up and they through concrete kinds of stories. And they'll start to, and you can start to ask, well, like, or concrete projects, like, well, what do we, if we do it this way, what are, do we miss something? Do we, so just exactly what you said, but in relationship to very concrete things that they're already working on and thinking about.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Bill. He wants to know, what the biggest impact this concept has had on your day-to-day work at Netflix.
So the biggest impact for me is really continuing to research my environment and my work, and continuing to pay explicit attention. It sort of, for me, it reframes part of what I do in my job. And the other thing that's happened in my particular area, in my particular position at Netflix, is that actually the domain in which I'm working is not particularly clear. There's a lot, for a lot of reasons. We have, not just one cross-functional team, but lots of people working on lots of different cross-functional projects. The scope of what we're doing actually extends well beyond the projects that we're working on. And there's a lot of different ideas about what this is that are not necessarily clear. And so I've found that my work lately has been very much on what is this thing, that we're working on. And I've started to reflect it back as, so almost as if my research right now is the group of people I'm working with, and I've started presenting my findings back to them, saying, here's the landscape of what I'm seeing, and using that to not just to tell them what they're doing, but as a kind of provocation to say, here's what I'm seeing, tell me if you think I've got it wrong, just as I would oftentimes with participants, right? So I find it a really valuable tool to share my insights with my participants so that they can tell me if they think I've got them wrong, or I've missed something. In the same way, I'm doing something very similar with the stakeholders that I work with, is sharing what I think the landscape of our work looks like, and both in order to create a little bit of dialogue, and also as what turns out, what I really like this term at Netflix, they call it farming for dissent, and and I really like it. I really like that idea. But I also think of it as kind of a provocation. Here's a thing, respond to it.
Oh, that's fantastic. You said something early on when you were introducing yourself, and you said, I create frameworks for thinking about complex, messy spaces, which is such an exciting way to think about what we do, right? Can you give us some examples of some of those messy spaces?
Yeah, so this is, again, most of my examples will come from Intel, partly because I'm still new at Netflix, and as you can hear, I'm still trying to figure out what my job is. So I don't want to say too much about it, but I spent a long time at Intel. So as part of my work at Intel, I got pulled into a conversation about what they were calling, it was about media manipulation and disinformation. There was a group of people that were interested in working on that. And I said, I don't think we know what we mean, right? And I find that is actually often the case. We come up with a term and we all use it, and it's great, especially big terms like disinformation or or toxicity. I was just working, and we're like, well, what do we actually mean by that? And one of the things that I did with that group, and I have to say, this is one of the reasons that I loved working at Intel. So somebody called me to talk to me about it. I said, you don't know what you mean. And then the next thing they did was invite me to the meeting and made me lead the working group on defining what we mean. I said, that's brilliant. When somebody tells you you're doing it all wrong, you invite them in and put them in charge of figuring it out. And so I was like, and actually the only thing that I complained about is he didn't give me any warning whatsoever. He invited me to the meeting and he said, and Jamie's going to lead this work group. And I was like, I am. But I really appreciated that. And so what we really did is we actually, and so I called in a group of people who I thought were smart, and I said, I have no idea how to define this. And I did some, looking around at different kinds of frameworks, and I tried to sort of take a hack at it. I use a method I call, and people who, I call it the shitty first draft method. So excuse my language for a minute, but I think that there can be great utility in bringing the bad draft. I'm going to come up with a bad idea, and you all will help me make it better because that's what you're here for. So I think, and because I think having some place to start is often good. So you start, so this is another, so we ended up creating a framework that was both broad enough to, around sort of the kinds of problems we thought we were talking about, and also enabled us to kind of see what we weren't working on. What are the pieces of this that fall out? In this case, we were really interested in the manipulation of audio and video, and that we were able to say, hey, actually, there's lots of disinformation that's actually, you don't have to manipulate anything. All you need to do is put a label on it. So you take a picture of Sarajevo and call it Portland, so you haven't manipulated the media itself. You've manipulated the framing, and we were very quickly able to say that's not what we're doing, and that's what that enabled. At the same time, you were talking, it's like, there's lots of media manipulation that is perfectly legitimate, all of special effects for example, right? And that's not what we mean either. And so we were able to kind of use that sort of that work in order to be explicit about what it is that we were working on and what it is that we were not working on. And that became actually a really powerful tool for that group, even though, by the way, I knew nothing about the technologies that we were proposing to use. The solutions themselves were well out of my depth in terms of my technological knowledge. And I find that that's actually a useful thing to know. I often don't fully understand the technologies that lie behind the things that we're developing. If you ask me about the parts of a silicon chip, I could give you people that could help you, but I don't always know. But what I do know is what people do. And so we meet in the middle. I say, you tell me what your component does and how it works, and I'll talk to you about what people do, and we'll figure out where we meet.
Oh, that is so interesting, and such a big, messy topic. Of which, if you could only just address it on a national level, we'd be really happy, Jamie.
Yeah, that would be great.
And when you're talking about the shitty first draft method, is that based on just assumptions that you're pulling together, like all of the things that people think it might be, and that becomes part of your draft, and then you poke holes in it, or?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, actually, the shitty first draft comes from actually my background as a theater director, right? As a theater director, you're pulling together a show, and you come in, and like all of these people are asking you questions, and you're like, I don't really know the answer. Should I wear my hair like this, or should I wear it like that? And I'm like, I don't know. But I really also felt like I would come in, I would have a vision of like, I don't know, you could enter from the left, and you could do this, and let's try it this way. And usually it was a bad idea. It wasn't particularly good, but what it did do is it gave us something to work with. And one of the actors would be like, hey, how about if I came in from under the table? Would that be better? I'm like, I don't know, let's try it. And so we would do that, but having some place to start was a really critical tool in enabling us to move forward, because you discover what you're not doing or what it's not. And so the shitty first draft is really my best effort. I'm not like, I don't want to sort of be, I am dismissive, but it is my best effort at the moment, but it lowers the bar in terms of like, I'm willing to be wrong. I'm pretty sure it is wrong, but I'm showing you, I'm not just telling you, but I'm showing you the direction in which I'm thinking. And if you have a better idea, by all means, please. This is what we're here for, is to figure out the right way. And so, in that particular group of people were incredible and came from so many different backgrounds. And one of the people I worked with was just, he took what I did and rearranged it all and came back with it all upside down. I'm like, I have no idea what you're doing. Explain it to me. And it turned, and we ended up sort of coming, that the end result was sort of a combination, but having something concrete to start with, and having defined it as not as the shitty first draft and not where we were going to end up. I think kind of like the spreadsheet that I described earlier, it invited the people I was working with to have ownership over it and to change it and to make it better. And what we came up with collectively, I do believe was better than the sum of our parts. I don't think any one of us could have figured it out alone, or figured it out as well on our own.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. A question has come in from Calvin. What approaches for arguments have you found to be most successful at helping business leaders understand the value that anthropology can bring to a corporate world?
So my manager recently was reminding me that the best argument is doing something that people find valuable. And so oftentimes when I talk to people about what research does, they don't really understand it and they don't necessarily see the value. So the best argument is showing and doing something. And I actually mean that that's actually relevant both for being in a company, so getting that first project done, but also even for what we were talking about a lot earlier in terms of resume building, crafting how you talk about it, even if what you're talking about is in a very different domain, if I can show how my work helped something, led to something, I'm starting to think in terms of results and impact. And that's what the people that are talking to me actually care about. They can begin to imagine how it might work for them. So ultimately the argument that works best is examples. I don't know. I hope that helps. I don't know. It's just because you say it doesn't make it easy, by the way. I just want to say it's like people telling you as a parent in parenting classes to be consistent. And if you have children, I hope you're rolling your eyes because it's not that easy. It's easy to say, not easy to do.
Well,
next.
Jamie, thank you so much. That's the last question that we have, unless somebody wants to sneak one in at the 5 minutes to go. But thank you. We appreciate your time. It was a really interesting subject. And we wish you the best of luck at Netflix.
And thank you so much. I really enjoyed my time here. And thank you to all who sat in.
Okay. Everyone who joined us today, thank you so much on behalf of Accelerant. We hope you have a wonderful day. And all of this will be made available on the website. So we hope that you join us for the next sessions. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.